Hey gang, we have it confirmed officially and in writing now that there will be a new class in the start of 2027, along with a special champion skin from the May community update for Space Marine 2. Now, there are 3 main classes the community have been gorging themselves over since the game came out: Apothecary, Librarian, and Terminator. On a side note, it is worth mentioning, it's not a crossover type scenario, but a similarity between Warhammer IP games and their DLCs in the last year or so. For example, 500 Worlds getting a big Necron release, and then Rogue Trader getting the Trazeen Museum DLC, and Space Marine 2 getting Tech Marine before Darktide getting Skitarii. So if another Warhammer IP has a Librarian, Apothecary, Chaplain, Terminator type thing going on, then I think it's a fairly big elephant in the battle barge to what to expect for this new class in Space Marine 2. I've never really understood the need for this class in Space Marine 2, as we have 2 types of stim pickups, Bulwark's Banner, and almost every class has some sort of health regen, contested health buff, or armor regen perks. So adding an Apothecary to give more HP or armor seems pretty nulling of those perks and equipments. Currently on tabletop, there are 2 types of Apothecary: the regular Primaris Apothecary and the Apothecary Biologus. These are 2 fairly same but different units. In the lore, a standard Apothecary basically lives in the back lines until they're needed at the front to recover Gene Seed from fallen Astartes, remove shrapnel from and cauterize wounds, and administer hyperdoses of combat stims to Astartes. These tend to wear Tacticus armor to allow for more movement and running in to act as a field medic to the squad. A Biologus Apothecary, on the other hand, is a much more frontline unit who just gathers samples for research on Xenos. They are trained medically, but they're more researchers, and as they are frontline, they tend to wear Gravis armor, which is heavier and more stompy. Saying this, they could be a Hive Scum type class, where Apothecary can give various buffs to other players with combat stims, or something kinda like Anna in Overwatch, being able to shoot teammates to heal them while being able to shoot enemies to do damage, or her ult shot to put them to sleep. Considering the effort they made to make Tech Marine one of the most well thought out classes in terms of perks and utilities, I'm not gonna completely discount getting an Apothecary, considering the devs have also been biting at the heels of Bulwark's Banner Heal and other classes' healing perks for some time now, with only significant pushback from players to revert those nerfs. In terms of weapons, Apothecary's default loadout is a Reductor Pistol and an Absolver Bolt Pistol, along with a close combat weapon. For the Biologus, this is the same but without access to the Reductor Pistol, as they're not going around collecting Gene Seed. Obviously, we have standard issue bolt pistols already in Space Marine 2, and a range of melee weapons. The one we don't have in the game is the Reductor Pistol, which is for breaking through power armor for fast Gene Seed retrieval. If this was implemented in-game, I would imagine this to act similarly to the Melter Pistol, but with maybe higher damage and even less range. So I don't really have my hopes up for that one. Both of these Apothecaries don't have a primary weapon, and the melee weapon they use is just generic name close combat weapon. So I'd be interested to see if they did just give him some standard issue things like a bolt rifle and a bolt carbine or a combat knife. On to some perks and ability options. Looking at tabletop again, the only thing I can imagine carrying over from a regular Apothecary is the Narthecium ability, which returns a destroyed model to play. In-game, this could be sort of a post-death defib, so if you have a mortal wound and die, then he can bring you back. I don't think this is too far-fetched to have, but whether it will be a class ability or a prestige perk interactable passive like the Tech Marine's turrets would be interesting. If the defib was a class passive, then we would be looking at that Hive Scum style hyperdose of combat stims as the class ability. On the Biologus, he has a couple of abilities that could translate into a video game quite well. The first is Surgical Precision. Units being led by this model gain lethal hits on their weapons. In Space Marine 2, this could work by using an aura type system, like the Battlefield Condition, to stay within a certain range of the Biologus to gain aura, or like the perks from Tech Marine that give the Tech Marine or the team bonus healing or damage when in range of a turret. Next is Vivispectrum, which needs a little bit of gymnastics, but hear me out. On tabletop, if an enemy unit is destroyed in a melee attack, until the end of the battle, this model has the objective control characteristic of 9, so in the game, we don't have objective control. But this could still work in having perk options or a prestige perk that stacks melee damage bonuses as long as you have armor, until are knocked back or downed. I feel like this would be very hard to balance, however, and either be useless or super OP. The last one I wanted to bring up for Biologists is the Oath of Moment rule. This essentially marks a unit and you get rerolls for hits and wounds against that target. I think this would work pretty well in Space Marine 2 as a kind of hunter's mark in WoW, at least how it used to work, where tagging or locking onto an enemy makes them take more damage. This would have to be a prestige perk, I think, rather than a class ability or team perk, as it would essentially be a personal Auspex scan, which is obviously Tactical's class ability. In terms of a champion pack, the only chapters with a special boy here is the Space Wolves and the Sanguinius Copas, the Blood Angels. Wolf Priests are sick. They're a hybrid of Chaplain and Apothecary and have one of the best designed models on tabletop in my opinion. The Sanguinary Priests are barely apothecaries when compared to the default. They still do all the basic things, but are mainly prioritizing preventing Blood Angels from falling to the Black Rage, which is the Red Thirst debuff they have from their gene seed. Both of these would be pretty cool to see added, especially the Wolf Priest because of that wolf skull helmet. It's no wonder there's no wolves on Fenris. We poached them all to make cool helmets in Space Marine 2. Let me know how you expect Apothecary to work, or want him to work. I know a lot of people want him for heals, but I just don't think that's viable unless they do significant nerfs again to Bulwark's Banner and the other classes' healing perks, which they already undid when they tried that before. One of the other classes people ask for is the Terminator. I feel like if we have this as a class, it would have to replace Bulwark and Heavy for it to have a spot in this game. As likewise to Apothecary and Biologist Apothecary, there are two options for Terminators, Regular and Assault. Both types have a very interesting ability as well that could be cool in Space Marine 2, but could also just be very broken to implement. So the regular Terminator, these can be equipped on tabletop with quite a lot of options. For primary weapons, there's a Storm Bolter, Assault Cannon, Cyclone Missile Launcher, and a Heavy Flamer. For secondaries, they have nothing. And for melee, they can have a Power Fist or a Chain Fist. Obviously, we don't have Chain Fists in Space Marine 2, and I'm unsure if there are any plans to add them. But what we do have in the game is an equivalent of the Storm Bolter in the Heavy Bolt Rifle and the Bolt Carbine, and we have the Heavy Flamer. But I don't see them adding the Assault Cannon or the Cyclone Missile Launcher to this game. The Assault Cannon would probably be too similar in usage to the Heavy Bolter due to the changes they made when translating Heavy Bolter from tabletop into Space Marine 2. The Cyclone Missile Launcher would be cool though. This is essentially on the ranged Chaos Terminators, the big backpack missiles that they have. This could work, to be honest, as a class ability, but I think it would be too similar to the servo gun on the Tech Marine. For secondaries, neither Terminator types take anything, but they would need one in Space Marine 2 for the gunstrike mechanic, so I would just assume default bolt pistols. Melee is, I think, a little more interesting for Terminators. We already have Power Fists in the game, and if we end up at a point where Saber is adding a third heroic weapons to weapons, then maybe we can see a heroic Power Fist with the heroic perk that has some sort of short chainsaw on it, making it into a Chain Fist. Otherwise, on the Assault Terminators, they don't take any primaries and look very similar to a Bulwark Assault hybrid, having the options of taking a Thunderhammer and a Storm Shield or twin Lightning Claws. In Space Marine 2, if your Bulwark takes a Thunderhammer, he cannot take a shield, so having a class where you could take both would be hilariously OP. As for the Lightning Claws, I'm pretty sure we've been told that they aren't viable. I'd assume because they would be dual-wielded gloves, so you wouldn't be able to pull out your secondary for gun strikes. I will say though, it would be pretty cool to have a perk added to the Bulwark class, or be able to get a heroic shield that makes it into a storm shield that can absorb stacks of power like the block weapons do on blocks, and be able to use that like the block stacks but in shield bashes. Technically we do have a storm shield, it's just one of the cosmetics that we can add onto the shield, but it would be cool to have it as an actual item. In terms of perks and abilities, on tabletop he's basically a tank, so he would have similar tanky sounding perks to Bulwark and Heavy. For class ability, there are technically two options. The first is the Cyclone missile launcher like we have the Techmarine servo gun, but unlike Techmarine you have to hunker down and wait for it to go off, sacrificing movement for an artillery barrage. On the other side would be their teleport homer from tabletop. This would be just being able to reposition essentially. Similar to the assault jump pack, maybe could be used with a perfect dodge, so having a kind of Wings of Flame type build where a perfect dodge teleport to a ranged attack bonus damage to encourage retreat tactics or jumping behind hordes quickly. I think for this though you would need to take into account the slowness of a Terminator and decrease his movement speed in exchange. I feel like there isn't much to say on this class being added, as it would just deny Bulwark, Heavy, and kinda Assault being worth taking on most team comps. The only upside to this being added is the Terminator Armor Drip, which we know everyone wants. Let me know if you wanted this class and how you think it would work to be added to Space Marine 2. I just think it would overlap too much and make others not worth taking. This could be a good thing, however, for people who like Vanguard or Sniper, as they would be a bit more useful than bringing a Bulwark or a Heavy if you already have a Terminator on the team. In terms of a champion pack, they mostly look all the same over the chapters with just slight changes to tabards and preferred weapons. The ones that are the most different are all 30k and mostly chaos, like the Iron Warriors Siege Terminator and the Death Guard Death Shroud Terminators. On the Loyalist side, we could have a Wolf Guard from the Space Wolves or a Dark Angel Deathwing Terminator that would go pretty hard. Or there is the Deathwatch Terminator that would make a lot of sense with the Datamined Deathwatch Power Fist with Melter attachment. And also from a lore standpoint, Second Company doesn't technically have Terminators. You can field them on tabletop in a Second Company army, but these are essentially squads on loan from First Company, and Space Marine 2 is a game about the Ultramarine Second Company, so I don't really see them being added. Next up is the Librarian. Now, I would love to have a Librarian. They look awesome in all their tabletop minis, and they can wear cowls and capes, which look super good in Space Marine 2. The problem with them is that they're psychers, and we have it pretty much 99% confirmed that we aren't getting psychers in this game. Maybe Space Marine 3, but definitely not in Space Marine 2. For example, the Grey Knight's heraldry. The majority, if not all, Grey Knights are psychers, so adding their heraldry will also probably never happen, as GW only wants lore-accurate additions to the game. Looking at Darktide, they obviously have the Psyker class. This class uses the Psyker's powers as a ranged and melee attack which bounces between enemies and putting debuffs on them. But like with the Apothecary and Hivescum similarities, having a Librarian to mirror the Psyker would be pretty apt. Just as a little side note, I couldn't get the Librarian add-on to work for Space Marine 2. It wasn't updated for patch 13, so I'm just showing you Psyker gameplay in the background from Darktide here. I'm sorry. So in Space Marine 2, if they were to implement this class, first off, they would have to rework half of the game. How damage works on enemies to allow bounces, other classes would need to be buffed a lot, and weapons as well just to keep up with the amount of spread on his Witchfire. So looking at tabletop, there are 3 flavors of Librarian: Standard, in Phobos armor, and in Terminator armor. So drip-wise, we always like more armor patterns to use. The only difference other than the armor type is that the Terminator one can add a combi weapon or a Storm Bolter to their loadout. For weapons, I think to make this balanced, I would remove his primary and just have his Witchfire. Much like in Darktide, this would be a multi-target attack with bouncing of damage between enemies. In perks, it would be more interesting to be able to change the damage type and the spread range, like how many times it can bounce to the next target. For example, being able to do pure damage that can spread further, or a more focused and shorter spread that adds a speed debuff like a nerfed shock grenade, or a direct bolt with very limited spread that more or less one-shots Minoris and incaps Majoris at max prestige. In all three options, it would need a cooldown like a weapon heat bar, but for refilling the Psyker mana bar essentially, with different energy spendage for each option. Again, in the lore, technically it's a lot more complicated than this, with things like telepathy powers, divination powers, Astartes powers, and all of the disciplines. So with telepathy powers, you can do things like dominate minds, compel others to do things, and bolster allies. These could work as team perks, potentially like a decrease in threat level of allies to enemies, and have a 40% chance for an enemy to turn on its allies, fighting as though it's on your squad for a while. Or giving allies an armor regen buff, like the Tech Marine Battlefield Repairs perk, or a similar thing like gain 1 chunk of contested health after performing an execution. With divination powers, these are things like reading the Emperor's Tarot, divination, the Possibility Shield, psychometry, and aura reading. Again, these could be perk options in the core section. Using divination could, for example, auto-tag Extremis and Terminus enemies upon spawning into the map, and give a provoked buff on allies so they have extra damage but only when hitting those enemies tagged by this. This could also just work as Emperor's Tarot against Chaos, like a kind of he asked the warp where they would spawn, as opposed to divining the location of physical Tyranids in real space. Psychometry and aura reading I'd mash together and be in an anti-enrage when an enemy is inside a certain range to the Librarian, and have like a 20% chance to enrage or re-enrage as they leave that radius. This could be pretty nice for hard strats with increased enrage spawns, but otherwise I'm not really too sure. Lastly on this, something like the Possibility Shield would be something just as simple as gaining 1 or 2 armor segments as base, and you don't gain anything from the armor boost equipment, so having an armor bar of equal length to your health bar. Then there's Astartes powers, like Might of the Ancients, which would empower him from the warp. Vortex of Doom, which is a large AoE burst, with a chance to spawn warp entities, and more shields and buffs. For all the disciplines, I'm not going to go through all the disciplines because I will just be here for an hour, but they can be trained in various little nitpicky things. It would be kind of insane to pick and choose from this and keep everyone happy. Like if you take abilities from the Fulmination discipline, but Leet Gamer 69XX wanted abilities from Geokinesis instead, it would just be a massive headache on top of being a pain to balance. Going back to the weapons, for secondary he only takes a bolt or plasma pistol, so I'd imagine a small collection of weapons here to pick from. And then in melee, they would have access to a power sword or a power axe, but their main attacks would be focused on their Witchfire. They do have some fairly OP options for a champion pack, however. They could go safe with the Ultramarines option of Chief Librarian Tigurius with his Hellfire hood. It would be awesome to be able to cosplay as this powerful Psyker of the Imperium. A second option would be similar, but for Blood Angels. Now we did just have a Weta Workshop release of a Mephiston statue, so who knows, maybe that was foreshadowing. But it would be really cool to have the ribbed chestplate and skirt in-game, along with a potential heroic power sword skin to match. Like I said, I love librarians as a concept, but as an ex-software dev of the game variety, I wouldn't want to implement this. It would just be a very large jumble of maths and if-else statements that nobody wants to have to wrap their head around, let alone the changes to other classes, enemies, and weapons that would need to happen on a giant scale to accommodate this class being added. The Humble Chaplain. I can safely say with 99% certainty that this is what the new class for next year will be. This could be a hybrid class of both Chaplain and Judiciars, and from what we know from previous data mines, I'm leaning towards this mashup. The first hint that we have, as much as it was an April Fool's joke last year, the dev team already added Chaplain once, even if it was just in the campaign and as a joke. It had a class ability called Discipline that was to instantly report any and all minor deviations from the Codex Astartes for a plus 5% discipline bonus and a negative 20% to Brotherhood. I don't imagine this will be in the game, but it shows that they've been thinking about this class for a while. The difference in lore between a Chaplain and Judicia is that a Judicia is a Space Marine in training to become a Chaplain, and the only real difference in loadout and abilities is that the Judicia uses an Executioner Relic Blade, which is a greatsword, and carrying a Tempor Mortis in his other hand to slow time in an area around himself. And then the Chaplain uses a Crozius Arcanum, which is essentially a power mace, or a staff, depending on who you ask. For ranged weapons, if we lump together all types of Chaplains, a Chaplain, Chaplain with a jump pack, Chaplain on a bike, and Chaplain in Terminator armor, he would have the choice of a limited number of primary weapons, the Stormbolter and the Twin Bolt Rifle. In Space Marine 2, we don't technically have a Stormbolter, but other classes that have this in their tabletop loadouts have access to the Auto Bolt Rifle and Bolt Carbine in their place, and same for the Twin-Linked Bolt Rifle. For secondaries, they would have access to the standard bolt pistols, along with potential for a new heroic bolt pistol, the Absolver bolt pistol. The heroic perk for this would be similar to the heroic plasma pistol, I imagine, as in lore and tabletop, Absolver pistols are described as a new generation of bolt pistol that shoots like a rifle with significant stopping power, so possible to have a knockback effect on hits as its perk. On melee, obviously the Crozius Arcanum Mace has great potential. If he comes with this as a separate weapon choice that only he can use, like Tech Marine's Omniscient Axe, or if this can be added as another heroic axe, that would be pretty cool. But GW will probably say no to that and just have it locked to the Chaplain. From previous data mines, they show dual wielding being added to some secondary weapons, which Chaplains are known to do, or at least assault Chaplains. It's looking like this class would be able to take 2 secondaries and a melee with no primary. This would also work for if you take the Executioner Relic Blade. We've seen data mines of this as a 2-handed greatsword. Now on tabletop it is single-handed and able to carry a primary weapon in his other hand, but in Space Marine 2 it sounds like it's going to be a new weapon. Plus, it being 2-handed like a Thunderhammer, so you'd lose your primary weapon like an assault but keep the dual pistols. This would be very cool to see how they implement though. As for perks and abilities, I think his class ability would be in a similar vein to his April Fool's one, but essentially be a battle shout to buff allies for a time, allowing for slow contested health regen and extra damage or immunity to knockbacks. It's also worth noting on Judicias with the Executioner Relic Blade, the tabletop ability Silent Fury, where upon killing an enemy model it adds 1 to the attacks of the sword. This could be implemented as a passive damage stack that goes up to a max of like 3 with chained executes, and then resets after no executions have been made for a number of seconds, and perks to decrease this time in exchange for extra damage bonus to Majoris or Extremis, or increase the time stack stay up in exchange for a lower damage bonus or slightly bigger perfect parry windows. They also have the Oath of Moment rule, being able to mark a unit to get rerolls for hits and wounds against that target. This would be fairly sick on this class, again working like the Hunter's Mark, giving a buff to attacks hitting it or a debuff to the target in some way, but would have to be a prestige perk rather than a class ability or team perk, as it would essentially be a personal Auspex scan, which is Tack's class ability. Another possibility for a class perk is the Judicia's Tempor Mortis, where activating it creates a zone in which enemies are slowed and take some damage, kind of like a shock grenade but without the electricity visual. For champions, the top of the pile is of course Asmodai, the legendary interrogator chaplain of the Dark Angels. His model is awesome, with the fancy cloth and his little capelet, his iconic iron skull mask, and giant iron halo that so many Dark Angels like to have. We could just be getting a more generic default Dark Angels Interrogator Chaplain, but they still look great. The only really other option is a Black Templar Grimaldus looking pack. This would also be really cool to have, as long as they don't hold back on the fully sculpted knee skulls and WWE belt. So, in conclusion, to have an apothecary that wouldn't break the game, it would need to be more of a clone of Hivescum from Darktide, using things like auras and temporary stimulants to increase damage, make a slow regain of contested health like the power-up orbs in the battlefield condition, or grant some kind of immunity to barbs or kind of thing, rather than be a direct healing class, which I think is just what everyone wants. The main issue is able to make a class that isn't then compulsory to take on all missions. Same with Terminator. There would just be way too much overlap with Bulwark and Heavy, and I don't really see why this class is needed, apart from just wanting to dress up. Then for Librarian, it just seems overcomplicated in terms of adding it to the game with the amount of powers and disciplines, even if they were all perks. There are too many, and someone will always complain. Also, since there's no Psyker buff already in the game, it would mean needing to rework a lot of things, like how damage taken is calculated in order for this to be a stable and consistently working class. So yeah, the next class will be Chaplain. I assume hybrided with a Judicia for the sword while also having the fancy mace and dual-wielded secondaries. Let me know your thoughts and feelsies below, or catch me live on here or on Twitch. I paint minis and obsess over Space Marine 2, so I'm always down for a yap. My Discord is also linked below, and as always, TYTY for watching, and see ya!